Can a destroyed vehicle, a smoking wreck that should be abandoned and forgotten, become the difference between life and death for 5 men pinned down in the desert by an enemy that outnumbers them 10 to 1? When an ambush leaves you stranded in the Egyptian desert near Alamein, with nothing but a burning jeep for cover. When German infantry are advancing on your position and you have maybe 100 rounds of ammunition between you and death, what kind of desperation transforms wreckage into fortress, turns liability into asset, makes you believe that twisted metal can save your life if you're stubborn enough to defend it? I'm 97 years old, and in October 1942, I was a 22-year-old corporal in an American liaison unit attached to British forces at El Alamein, part of the small American military presence supporting the British 8th Army in what would become one of the decisive battles of World War II. This is the story of how 5 men turned a destroyed jeep into an improvised defensive position and held against overwhelming odds for 6 hours until British tanks broke through and saved us. How desperation and ingenuity can transform the useless into the essential. How sometimes survival depends on refusing to accept that the situation is hopeless. My name is George Raymond Mitchell, and I was serving with a small American liaison detachment attached to British forces in Egypt in 1942, part of the limited American military involvement in the North Africa campaign before Operation Torch and the full American commitment to the theater. Our role was primarily observation and coordination, learning from British experience fighting Rommel's Africa Corps, preparing for eventual American operations in North Africa, and providing technical expertise on American equipment that was being supplied to British forces through Lend-Lease. It wasn't combat duty in the traditional sense. We weren't assigned to frontline units, but in the fluid warfare of the desert where lines were porous and the front could shift dozens of miles in hours, observation duty could become combat without warning. I'd arrived in Egypt in August 1942. Had spent weeks learning desert warfare from British veterans who'd been fighting in North Africa for 2 years. Had observed tank battles and infantry operations, and the unique challenges of combat in terrain that offered no cover, and where logistics determined outcomes as surely as tactics. The British were professional and welcoming, shared their hard-won knowledge generously, treated us as colleagues rather than the inexperienced allies we clearly were. I learned about navigation in featureless desert, about water discipline and heat management, about maintenance challenges created by sand and dust, about the German tactics that had made Rommel legendary and the British countermeasures that were slowly turning the tide. By October 1942, the strategic situation had stabilized along a line near El Alamein, a small railway stop on the Egyptian coast where the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the impassable Qattara Depression to the south created a narrow corridor that couldn't be flanked. British forces under General Montgomery had been building strength, stockpiling supplies, preparing for an offensive that would break Rommel's forces and begin the long push that would eventually drive the Axis out of Africa. The Second Battle of El Alamein began on October 23, 1942, with a massive British artillery barrage, followed by infantry and armor assaults that would last for nearly 2 weeks, and that would prove to be the turning point of the North Africa campaign. My role during the battle was to observe and report, to move between British units gathering information about American equipment performance, to coordinate with British intelligence about German dispositions and tactics, to maintain communication with American headquarters in Cairo. I traveled with a small team, 5 men total. Myself as team leader, Private Eddie Kowalski from Detroit as driver, Corporal James Harrison from Texas as radio man, Private Tommy Wilson from Georgia as my assistant, and Sergeant William Chen from San Francisco as our technical specialist on American equipment. We moved around the battlefield in a Willys Jeep, one of the thousands of American-built vehicles that were transforming military mobility, carrying radio equipment and observation gear, generally staying behind the front lines but occasionally finding ourselves closer to combat than headquarters probably intended. On October 28, 1942, the 6th day of the battle, we were traveling from one British position to another, moving through desert that should have been secure British rear area, but that turned out to be more contested than maps suggested. The battle had created fluid situations. German and British forces were intermingled in some areas, and accurate real-time information about who controlled what terrain was often unavailable. We were following directions given by a British major, heading toward a regiment that was supposed to be about 10 kilometers west of our starting point, navigating by compass and terrain features in landscape that was mostly flat, sandy desert with occasional rocky outcrops. We'd been traveling for maybe 45 minutes, had covered about 8 kilometers, were approaching what we thought was our destination when we came under fire. German infantry, maybe 30 or 40 men, opened up from positions among rocks about 200 meters to our left. Machine gun and rifle fire that caught us completely by surprise. Kowalski reacted instantly, floored the accelerator, tried to get us out of the kill zone. But we'd been traveling slowly because of rough terrain and the Jeep couldn't accelerate fast enough. I felt impacts hitting the vehicle, heard the distinctive sound of bullets penetrating metal, and then the engine died, hit by fire that disabled something critical. The Jeep coasted maybe 50 meters on momentum before stopping, leaving us stranded in open desert under fire from prepared positions. We bailed out of the Jeep, took what cover we could behind the vehicle, returned fire with our rifles, and the Jeep's mounted .30 caliber machine gun that Wilson managed to swing toward the German positions. But we were badly outnumbered, had minimal ammunition, were in the open with no reinforcements nearby, and the tactical situation was hopeless. The Germans had us pinned, were maneuvering to flank our position, and we had maybe minutes before they closed the distance and finished us off or forced us to surrender. Harrison tried the radio, found it was damaged by the fire that had disabled the engine, couldn't establish communication with anyone who could send help. Wilson was firing the .30 caliber, trying to suppress the German advance, but ammunition for the gun was limited, and we couldn't sustain that rate of fire for long. Chen was on his rifle picking targets, making his shots count because we each had maybe 30 rounds total, and every round had to accomplish something. I was trying to assess our situation, trying to figure out how to survive the next few minutes, trying to make decisions with inadequate information and no good options. The Jeep was smoking. Something in the engine compartment had caught fire, and I realized we were about to lose even the minimal cover the vehicle provided. If it burned completely, if the fuel tank exploded, we'd be left in the open with no protection at all. But then I had an idea born of desperation rather than tactical brilliance. What if we could use the Jeep differently? Not as cover to hide behind, but as an active defensive position, as the anchor for an improvised fortress that would give us fighting positions and protection that open terrain couldn't provide. I called the team together, explained my idea quickly while German fire continued around us. We'd flip the Jeep on its side, creating a vertical barrier instead of just the low horizontal cover it currently provided. We'd dig in around it, use sand to build up firing positions, create a defensive perimeter that would make us harder to overrun than we'd be in the open. It was desperate, probably wouldn't work against a determined assault, but it was better than our current situation, and it gave us something to do besides waiting to die. We moved fast, all 5 of us pushing and pulling on the Jeep despite its weight and despite the fire that was still coming in. The vehicle was heavy, maybe 2,500 pounds, but adrenaline and desperation gave us strength we didn't know we had. We rocked it, lifted one side, and finally flipped it over onto its side, creating a 6-foot-tall barrier of metal and rubber and mechanical components. The fuel tank didn't explode. The fire in the engine compartment smothered when the Jeep tipped. And suddenly we had a defensive position that was far better than we'd had seconds earlier. We started digging immediately, using entrenching tools and our hands, creating fighting positions around the Jeep that would give us protected fields of fire. The sandy desert soil was relatively easy to dig, but collapsed easily, required constant maintenance. But we built up berms and positions that provided some protection from German fire. We positioned the .30 caliber machine gun on top of the Jeep's sideways chassis, giving Wilson an elevated position with good visibility and fields of fire. We established positions for the riflemen that used the Jeep's body as cover, while allowing us to fire at approaching Germans. The transformation took maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes of frantic work while under fire. 10 minutes where we were vulnerable and exposed, but where the Germans apparently hadn't expected us to do anything except surrender or die. When we were finished, we had something that resembled a defensive position, an improvised fortress built around a destroyed vehicle, protection that wasn't much, but that was infinitely better than being in the open. The Germans recognized what we'd done, increased their fire, probed our position to test our defenses. Wilson opened up with the .30 caliber, short bursts that conserved ammunition while keeping German infantry at a distance. The riflemen picked targets, made our shots count, created the impression that we were better armed and more numerous than we actually were. The Jeep's body absorbed fire that would have hit us, the metal chassis and engine block providing protection that saved our lives dozens of times in the first hour of the siege. But our situation remained desperate. We had limited ammunition, maybe 60 rounds per rifleman and a few hundred rounds for the machine gun. Not nearly enough for a sustained defense. We had no water, had left our canteens in the Jeep, and they'd been destroyed or lost during the firefight and the flipping of the vehicle. We had no communication with friendly forces, no way to call for help, no expectation of relief unless someone happened to stumble across us. We were 5 Americans in the middle of the Egyptian desert, surrounded by Germans who had every advantage except the psychological one. They didn't know how desperate our situation was, didn't know we were barely hanging on, assumed we were better positioned and supported than we actually were. The afternoon wore on, temperatures climbing above 100 degrees, the sun beating down on our position, thirst becoming as serious a problem as the Germans. We rationed ammunition carefully, fired only when we had clear targets, made every round accomplish something. The Germans probed repeatedly, testing our defenses, trying to find weaknesses, but each probe was beaten back by fire from the .30 caliber or from our rifles, creating the illusion that we had resources we didn't actually have. Around 1600 hours, 4 hours into the siege, we were down to maybe 20 rounds per man, and the machine gun was almost empty. Wilson fired the last belt, 50 rounds that he stretched across several minutes. Then the gun was silent, reduced to an empty weapon that still served psychological purpose because the Germans didn't know it was empty. We were down to rifles, 5 men with rifles and a handful of rounds each, and the next serious German assault would probably overrun our position because we didn't have the ammunition to stop it. But the Germans didn't know that, couldn't see inside our position, couldn't assess our actual capabilities. They'd been probing and taking casualties, had lost men to our fire, and apparently their commander was cautious enough to avoid a frontal assault that would cost lives even if it succeeded. So they maintained pressure, kept us pinned, waited for darkness or reinforcements or for us to make a mistake, while we sat in our improvised fortress built around a destroyed Jeep and tried to survive another hour. The thirst was becoming unbearable. Worse than the Germans. Worse than the heat. A constant torment that affected decision-making and physical capability. We were all showing signs of dehydration, headaches and dizziness and difficulty concentrating, but there was nothing we could do about it except endure and hope that relief arrived before we became too weak to fight. Chen tried to keep morale up, told jokes and stories, reminded us that British forces were nearby and would be looking for us when we didn't report in. But we all knew that finding 5 men in the desert would be difficult, and that help might not arrive in time. As the sun began to set around 1800 hours, we heard it. The distinctive sound of tank engines, multiple vehicles moving across the desert getting closer. We didn't know if they were German or British, friend or enemy, salvation, or the final assault that would finish us. We readied our few remaining rounds, prepared to fight regardless of how hopeless it was, accepted that we'd probably die in the next few minutes, but determined to make the Germans pay for our lives. Then we saw them. 3 British Matilda tanks moving toward our position from the east, their commanders apparently having seen the firefight or having been sent to investigate when we failed to report. The Germans saw them too, broke contact immediately, withdrew rather than engage the tanks, melted back into the desert and disappeared. The siege was over, we'd survived. 5 men in an improvised fortress built around a destroyed Jeep had held for 6 hours against overwhelming odds and had lived to tell about it. The British tankers reached our position, were amazed to find Americans, were even more amazed when they saw what we'd done, how we'd transformed a destroyed vehicle into a defensive position that had saved our lives. They gave us water, evacuated us to a British aid station, took care of us with the professionalism that characterized the 8th Army. We were dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise unhurt, had survived despite having every reason to die, had proven that improvisation and determination could overcome impossible tactical situations. The destroyed Jeep remained in that position for weeks, other units passing it during the British advance, some stopping to examine it and figure out what had happened. The story spread, became legend in the small American community in Egypt, was retold with embellishments that made it more dramatic than it had been, though the reality was dramatic enough. That Jeep, that pile of twisted metal and burned components, became a symbol of American ingenuity and refusal to quit. Proof that sometimes the tools of survival exist in unexpected forms if you're creative enough to recognize them. I continued my liaison duties through the rest of the Alamein battle and into the pursuit of Rommel's retreating forces, eventually transferred to American units when Operation Torch brought U.S. forces into North Africa in November 1942. I fought through the Tunisia campaign, landed in Sicily, survived the war and came home in 1945. But that day with the Jeep, those 6 hours of desperate defense with 5 men and minimal resources, remained the experience that defined my understanding of what soldiers could accomplish when they refused to accept defeat. The question I've pondered for 80 years is what made the difference. What allowed 5 men in an impossible situation to survive, when by all logic we should have died or been captured? Part of it was luck, the Germans being cautious when a more aggressive commander would have overrun us in the first hour. Part of it was the psychological advantage we created, making the enemy believe we were stronger than we actually were. Part of it was the British tanks arriving at exactly the right moment, the kind of timing that can't be planned or controlled. But mostly, I think, it was the decision to act rather than accept, to transform a destroyed vehicle into a fortress, rather than abandon it as useless to fight creatively when conventional tactics had failed. That Jeep should have been meaningless after it was disabled, should have been left behind as we scattered into the desert trying to escape on foot. But by flipping it, by building positions around it, by using it as the anchor for an improvised defense, we created something useful from wreckage, turned liability into asset, demonstrated that sometimes survival depends on seeing potential where others see only failure. The broader lesson extends beyond combat to how we approach problems and challenges in any context. Resources exist in unexpected forms. Solutions appear when you're creative enough to recognize them. The tools you need might already be present if you can see them differently. That destroyed Jeep wasn't obviously a defensive position, wasn't designed for that purpose, but when we needed a shield and had nothing else available, it became exactly what we needed because we refused to accept that it was useless. I'm 97 years old now, one of the last surviving Americans who served at El Alamein, one of the few who can bear witness to what happened in that desert battle and to the small actions that don't make history books, but that mattered enormously to the men who lived them. The destroyed Jeep is long gone, scrapped or buried or scattered by winds and time, exists now only in memories and in the stories that a few old men tell about survival and ingenuity and refusing to quit. But the lesson remains, the understanding that sometimes the difference between life and death is the willingness to use whatever resources exist in unexpected ways, to see potential where others see only wreckage, to transform the useless into the essential through creativity and determination. That lesson has served me throughout my life, has shaped how I approach challenges, has made me more confident in my ability to find solutions when conventional approaches fail. If this story moved you, if it helped you understand what soldiers endured in the North Africa campaign and how desperation can breed innovation, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from World War II veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember the soldiers who fought at El Alamein, who improvised and adapted and survived against impossible odds. Remember that sometimes the tools of survival exist in unexpected forms, that wreckage can become fortress, that refusing to accept defeat is the first step toward survival. Thank you for listening to this old soldier's memories of how a destroyed Jeep became a shield in the African desert, and how 5 men learned that hope exists even in the most desperate circumstances.